Hello, everyone. Europe has literally howled under the grip of Arctic cold as temperatures plunged to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Gas storage facilities dropped below the critical 10% mark, and an entire pack of high-ranking European Union officials humiliatingly traveled to Moscow to beg the Kremlin to restore the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine, a transit route that the Europeans themselves helped shut down a year earlier. President Vladimir Putin harshly reminded the delegation of every single anti-Russian sanctions package imposed over recent years, all the public mockery from European politicians about their dependence on Russian gas, and the self-confident declarations about a rapid transition to alternative energy sources. All those promises turned out to be empty words. Freezing European cities descended into chaos as daily power outages became the norm. Industrial enterprises began shutting down production en masse because of astronomical energy prices, while ordinary citizens found themselves unable to pay utility bills that had increased 5 to 10 times within a single year. Germany and France, Italy and Poland faced an unprecedented energy crisis that threatened the complete collapse of their economies and explosive social unrest. Millions took to the streets, demanding that governments immediately restore cheap Russian gas supplies at any cost, even at the price of lifting sanctions and admitting defeat in the energy war. Today we will examine in detail how Europe ended up in this catastrophic situation, an energy crisis of unprecedented scale. Arctic winter temperatures of minus 20 degrees coincided with a critical depletion of gas storage to below 10%, creating a real threat of complete heating shutdowns in the continent's largest cities. Why did Europe's much-praised transition to alternative energy sources, including liquefied natural gas from the United States and Qatar, Norwegian oil, renewable energy, wind turbines, and solar panels, fail so spectacularly? Why were these alternatives unable to compensate for the volumes of cheap Russian pipeline gas supplied for decades? And which specific high-ranking EU officials, including representatives of the European Commission and the German, French, and Italian governments, humiliatingly arrived in Moscow, hat in hand, pleading with the Kremlin to restore gas transit? We will reveal how President Putin received the European delegation, methodically reminding them of all 15 packages of anti-Russian sanctions introduced since 2014. We will recall the public mockery and ridicule from European leaders who claimed Russia's economy would be torn to shreds by sanctions, and their confident declarations of independence from Russian gas, statements that turned out to be nothing more than propaganda unsupported by real capabilities. We will also analyze the harsh conditions the Kremlin put forward for any possible resumption of supplies, including the lifting of sanctions, payment in rubles, recognition of new territories, and compensation for Gazprom's losses. Stay with us to learn what kind of chaos engulfed freezing European cities when daily power outages paralyzed transport, communications, hospitals, and schools, leaving millions without light, heat, or hot water in the middle of a brutal winter. We will explain why industrial giants in Germany, France, and Italy, including steel mills, chemical plants, and automobile factories, began halting production, closing workshops, and laying off workers because they could not withstand energy prices that had risen 10 to 15 times compared to the era of cheap Russian gas, and how ordinary Europeans reacted to this energy collapse as heating and electricity bills increased 5 to 10-fold, making them unbearable, even for the middle class, let alone the poor. We will answer the main question: does the humiliating visit of the European delegation to Moscow mean the final capitulation of the EU in the energy war? Does it represent an admission that the attempt to survive without Russian energy resources has failed catastrophically, collapsing the economy and living standards? And is the Kremlin even ready to resume supplies, or will it use Europe's desperation to impose maximum political demands, including the lifting of all sanctions, recognition of Russian territories, and an end to support for Ukraine. Let us begin with a detailed analysis of how the European Union ended up in an absolutely catastrophic situation, an energy crisis of unprecedented scale in post-war history, threatening total collapse of industry, transport, utilities, and social stability. The Arctic winter of 2025-2026, with persistent temperatures of -15 to -20 degrees across Germany, France, and Poland, and -25 to -30 degrees in Scandinavia, coincided with a catastrophic depletion of underground gas storage to record lows, below 10% of capacity. In normal years, when Russian gas was available, storage levels remained at 50 to 60% by midwinter, providing a comfortable reserve for prolonged cold spells. Current gas reserves in Europe are physically incapable of ensuring heating for residential buildings, offices, schools, hospitals, and gas-powered power plants through the rest of the winter season, which will last at least another 2 to 3 months until April. Mathematical calculations by European energy companies show that at current consumption rates, driven by abnormal frost, and with storage at only 10%, gas will run out completely by late February or early March. This would leave Europe without heating during the coldest month and a half of winter. This creates a real deadly threat of a complete shutdown of centralized heating systems in the continent's largest cities, including Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, and Milan. Millions of people would find themselves in freezing apartments at sub-zero temperatures. The much-advertised European transition to alternative energy sources, which was supposed to replace cheap Russian pipeline gas, failed with a deafening crash. It demonstrated a complete inability to compensate for the supply volumes lost after transit through Ukraine was halted. Liquefied natural gas from the United States, Qatar, and Australia, delivered by tankers to regasification terminals, turned out to be 3 to 4 times more expensive than Russian pipeline gas, making it economically devastating for industry and households. Moreover, the physical volumes of LNG available on the global market are limited by competition with Asia. China, Japan, and South Korea are willing to pay any price for energy resources, creating a supply deficit. Norwegian oil and gas from offshore North Sea fields cannot compensate for Russian volumes due to limited reserves and declining production at fields that have been exploited for decades. Norway physically cannot increase gas production by more than 10 to 15%, which represents only a small fraction of the lost Russian supplies that previously reached 150 to 170 billion cubic meters annually. Renewable energy, including wind turbines, solar panels, and hydroelectric plants, has shown critical unreliability during winter. Solar generation drops to a minimum due to short daylight hours, cloud cover, and snow. Wind power suffers from either calm conditions or hurricane-force winds that require turbines to be shut down. Against this backdrop, a whole group of high-ranking EU officials, including the Deputy Chair of the European Commission responsible for energy, representatives of the German Ministry of Economy, the French Ministry of Energy, the Italian government, and the Polish energy sector, humiliatingly arrived in Moscow, literally hat in hand, begging Russian leadership to restore gas transit through Ukrainian territory. This was an unprecedented humiliation for European diplomacy, which for years had arrogantly lectured Russia with sanctions, threats, and moralizing rhetoric. Now it was forced to crawl on its knees asking for help, admitting the total failure of its strategy of energy independence from Moscow. President Vladimir Putin received the European delegation with icy politeness and iron firmness, methodically recalling all 15 major packages of anti-Russian economic sanctions introduced by the EU since 2014 after Crimea's reunification with Russia. Putin listed sanctions against Russian banks cut off from SWIFT, which paralyzed international settlements. He reminded them of the freezing of $300 billion in Russian gold and foreign currency reserves held in Western banks. The largest theft of sovereign assets in history. He recalled bans on imports of Russian oil, gas, and coal, which crushed export revenues, and embargoes on high-tech equipment and microchip components for Russian industry. The Russian leader sarcastically quoted public mockery by European politicians who promised to tear Russia's economy to shreds with sanctions, turn it into a global trade outcast, collapse the ruble, provoke default, and spark mass protests against the Kremlin. Putin reminded them of the confident statements by the German Chancellor, the French President, and the European Commission Chair about a quick and painless transition to alternative energy sources and complete independence from Russian gas by winter 2023, then 2024, then 2025. Year after year, these promises proved to be empty propaganda unsupported by real infrastructure or investment. The Russian president then put forward harsh, uncompromising conditions for any theoretical resumption of gas supplies to freezing Europe. These included several fundamental political and economic demands. First, the complete and unconditional cancellation of all anti-Russian sanctions introduced since 2014, including the unfreezing of $300 billion in sovereign assets, the return of Russian banks to SWIFT, and the lifting of embargoes on oil, technology, and equipment. Second, a transition to 100% payment for Russians, gas in rubles at an exchange rate set by the Central Bank of Russia, excluding currency manipulation and speculation. Third, official political recognition by all EU countries of new Russian territories, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, as integral parts of the Russian Federation. Fourth, full financial compensation to Gazprom for all economic losses caused by European sanctions, including lost profits from undelivered gas, missed income from frozen projects, and penalties for broken contracts, totaling hundreds of billions of euros. Fifth, an immediate and complete halt to any military, financial, humanitarian, or diplomatic support for the Ukrainian regime, including arms supplies, military training, budget financing, and sanctions against Russia. Sixth, the signing of long-term contracts, 20 to 30 years, for Russian gas supplies with fixed volumes and pricing formulas protecting Gazprom from future political risks and guaranteeing stable income. These conditions effectively mean Europe's total, unconditional capitulation in the energy and geopolitical war with Russia, an admission of the failure of sanctions strategy and attempts to isolate Moscow. European officials were stunned. They understood that fulfilling Russian demands was politically impossible for their governments, as it would mean admitting the failure of their entire anti-Russian policy. But refusing the conditions would doom Europe to continue its energy crisis with catastrophic consequences. The delegation tried to bargain, proposing partial sanction relief and gradual implementation of demands over time. But Putin firmly refused, insisting on an all-or-nothing principle with no compromises. Meanwhile, freezing European cities descended into unprecedented chaos as daily scheduled power outages lasting 4 to 8 hours became the new harsh reality. Public transport, subways, trams, trolley buses, commuter trains came to a standstill, leaving millions without transportation and forcing them to walk kilometers in freezing weather. Mobile communications and internet access periodically disappeared when base stations lost power, isolating people from each other. Hospitals operated on backup diesel generators, but fuel for them became expensive and scarce, creating life-threatening risks for patients in intensive care. Schools closed for forced holidays because it was impossible to conduct classes without heating, with classroom temperatures near zero. Offices shifted employees to remote work, but homes were cold too because centralized heating operated intermittently to save gas. Supermarkets shortened operating hours to daylight only, since lighting consumes scarce electricity and refrigeration equipment requires uninterrupted power. Millions were left without light, heat, or hot water in the middle of a brutal winter, returning to medieval living conditions with stoves, candles, and kerosene lamps. Industrial giants in Germany, France, and Italy, the backbone of the European economy, including steel plants, chemical factories, car manufacturers, and engineering enterprises, shut down production en masse. Workshops closed, workers were sent on unpaid leave or laid off, unable to withstand astronomical energy prices. Metallurgy, which requires continuous blast furnace operation at extremely high temperatures, physically cannot function with gas prices of 300–400 euros per 1,000 cubic meters compared to 40–50 euros in the era of cheap Russian gas. Production became unprofitable. The chemical industry, producing fertilizers, plastics, and pharmaceuticals, needs gas both as feedstock and energy for reactors. At current prices, it became uncompetitive, losing out to Chinese and Indian producers using cheap energy. Automotive giants like Volkswagen, BMW, Renault, Fiat, and Peugeot halted assembly lines because component suppliers closed factories due to energy costs, breaking supply chains, and making car production impossible. Unemployment soared to double digits, 10, 12, 15% in industrial regions, creating social tension. Ordinary European citizens, the middle class, workers, pensioners, faced unbearable utility bills for heating and electricity, which increased 5 to 10 times compared to the era of cheap Russian gas. An average German family that once paid 100–150 euros per month for gas heating now receives bills of 500–700 euros, consuming half or more of their post-tax income. Pensioners receiving 800 euros in pensions are physically unable to pay utility bills and must choose between food and warmth, freezing in apartments or going hungry. Mass protests swept capitals and major cities across Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and Austria. Hundreds of thousands of angry citizens poured into the streets demanding their governments immediately restore cheap Russian gas supplies at any cost, even lifting sanctions, recognizing Russian terms, and ending support for Ukraine. Protesters carried banners reading, "Gas is more important than Ukraine. We want Russian gas. Down with sanctions. Bring back normal life." They openly accused their own governments of starting an energy war with Russia that Europe catastrophically lost. Police tried to disperse demonstrations, but the scale of protests was too large, creating a real threat of governments being overthrown by popular unrest. This is the reality Europe faces today, a continent freezing in the dark, struggling with an energy crisis of historic proportions, confronting the consequences of political decisions that have reshaped daily life for millions. The question remains, how long can Europe endure these conditions? And what price is it ultimately willing to pay to survive the winter?